Hi, I'm Dr. Janice Morrow. Thanks for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings, where we talk about the brain and all things related to mental health. Welcome. Our guest today is Dr. Reza Ghomi. He is a Boston-based neuropsychiatrist engineer who founded Frontier Psychiatry and MedFlow. So we're going to be discussing Alzheimer's and dementia and early warning, early signs, to help people recognize it when their loved ones are struggling, and to help differentiate, because Alzheimer's, like a lot of people think that just because you have, you're forgetting things, that you have Alzheimer's, and there's various forms of dementia. So he's going to help us clarify that, and we're just going to give him the floor. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Janice.
All right, so let's just jump right in. If you could talk about the most common form. I've read that the most common form of dementia is frontotemporal dementia. If you could differentiate that from what people think of when they hear Alzheimer's, the different areas of the brain and the different presentations.
Sure, sure, absolutely. And so if we think of dementia as a biological process that's causing this persistent progressive decline, meaning someone is slowly losing function, and the different types of dementia get at which function, but the overarching theme is there's a slow and progressive decline of some kind of function and cognition. And so in terms of dementia, the most common form, it depends on age group. So it's kind of, I'm try to spare you so many caveats. Obviously
Yeah. Oh, this is very interesting.
it's hard, when you're in clinic. Obviously, I want to make sure this is accessible for the wider audience, of course, because you get into any field you're in, right? It gets very nuanced. In dementia, I'll say in general, the most common form is Alzheimer's. Once you get much older, much past 80, 85, 90, there are some newer forms that we're recognizing that are actually quite common. One is driven by a different protein. So Alzheimer's, what we call Alzheimer's means that it's being driven by amyloid and tau proteins, meaning there's something going awry with them and they're causing damage to the brain. That typically happens in the short-term memory types of areas, but people with Alzheimer's can have a range of initial symptoms. So with Alzheimer's, you can have short-term memory loss, or you might be misplacing your keys. You might be getting lost with your car. You might be forgetting to pay a bill. That's all can fall under Alzheimer's. It's Alzheimer's. It's amyloid and tau protein, excuse me, and that's typically the most common. When we get much older, there's another protein called TDP-43 that ends up actually really increasing as your age goes up. And so we've now found out in hindsight, after following people and doing autopsies on their brain after postmortem, that a huge percentage, even up to half or more than half of cases we thought were other dementias or some completely something different. And this TD, it's called late limbic predominant age-related TDP-43 encephalopathy. It's a very long name. But after age 80, actually, that's about half of cases. It's quite common. And that very specifically goes into the short-term memory centers, your hippocampus on both sides, and really causes this extreme shrinking. So it can look like Alzheimer's. We'll assume they have Alzheimer's when they're older, but in fact, it's not Alzheimer's. So those are the most common across the age spectrum, but not far behind is vascular dementia, very common, especially in the US, but worldwide, right? We have a lot of vascular issues, heart disease related things, strokes that all can contribute to vascular dementia. There's Lewy body dementia. And then frontotemporal dementia is actually a bit less common. True frontotemporal dementias, by 10% or less of dementias.
Oh, okay. So what's the kind people look at Bruce Willis and he's got
Yes.
something, but that's not Alzheimer's, right? It's something else.
What I think, and based on what he's publicly disclosed, his family, so they haven't come out, to my knowledge, and said very specifically, but what I think they're referring to, they've said things like semantic, and they've said things like, I think aphasia, which is loss of language aphasia. There's a lot of asias in neurology, and those are loss of something. And so aphasia is a loss of language. So I think what they're referring to is semantic variant, primary progressive aphasia, which is a subtype of frontotemporal dementia. So again, it took me years to sort this out in my head, but I think he's in the FTD family, the frontotemporal dementia, and then in the language variant.
Okay. Well, I'd love to go on and talk about how Alzheimer's leads to death. So I have a close
Sure.
friend. He's been like my second dad. I lived with him in San Diego when I went to college. So for the last 40 years, this man named Bill's been like, and about 15 years ago, he started showing signs of memory loss. I didn't recognize it at all. I kind of chucked it off to just normal. Forget it was an outsider, another friend that was visiting and said, "Hey, I think something's going on with your friend Bill." But what I didn't know until I was around somebody, it happened to somebody close to me, is all the other things like the kind of a cat how a lot of the time there's just these catatonic stares and they lose their whole. He was like super vibrant and laughing and always going out. And now, yeah, for the last several years, it's almost like a catatonic stare, expressionless, and then the shuffling of the gait. So, what's going on with all of that when we see people with Alzheimer's?
Sure, sure. Great question. Because you're right, it's not necessarily the Alzheimer's itself, those amyloid proteins in a specific part of your brain that spell the end of life, those very last moments, but it is the impact they have on things like eating, breathing, maybe choking, things like that. In terms of your friend, and did you say how old is he?
So he's about 84 now.
Okay.
They just moved him into a home in March because he's been
Yeah.
at home with caregivers and family, and it just got to be like forgetting to go to the bathroom. He'd get up to go to the
Got it.
bathroom and just start going to the bathroom everywhere in the house, and the family said
Right.
we can't do it anymore. It's too
Got
much.
it.
And getting scared when he was left alone.
Right.
He didn't ever try to wander off like a lot of people, but he was fine. He mostly slept but it's heartbreaking to see that they had to put him in a home, but he'll be well taken care of. Yeah.
Makes sense. And that's a very common point reached by many. And because in our society, a lot of our older folks are aging without, live-in support from family, we have to rely on outside supports, like these different types of facilities, or sometimes in-home caregiver support still coming from outside the family. In terms of dementia and Alzheimer's, all paths tend to lead to very similar outcomes the longer you have it, meaning it becomes harder and harder to differentiate with time. Do you have Alzheimer's? Do you have vascular disease? Do you have frontotemporal dementia? They all start to look more similar with time. And so we all kind of merge. And that's really because if you think about it, if your brain is being damaged, there's only so much brain. So as your brain is damaged, there's less and less brain. So there's less and less to damage. And so what's left is going to look the same as everything else, if that's one way to think about it. And so for your friend, that could be common pathway for lots of things, but assuming it's Alzheimer's, things like what you're describing are very, very common. And what's very common also is that there will be good days and bad days, or good moments and bad moments. Like mornings tend to be sharper than afternoons. That has a lot to just do with little things like our cortisol levels and sleep and how fresh you are, right? All the things that as an adult, we're really good at filtering, well, most of us, and sometimes I have my days, right? But often, if I'm like a little tired, for example, let's say, Janice, you're a little tired, you're still going to show up, you're still going to do, your interview, and you're going to do a pretty good job. In fact, most people might not even realize that maybe you didn't sleep last night. You're able to hide that. When you have dementia, you can't hide it because that frontal lobe, the cortex, the area of our brain that makes us most human is what's hurt first and hurt the most. And so you're really relying more on your limbic system or your, let's say, your reptilian brain, right? Like the older stuff that we have in common with other animals. And that's why it starts to look the same, like, oh, he's acting very aggressive or confused, and he's just, going to the bathroom everywhere. That's because he just simply can't control, he can't control impulses or urges. So if he has to go, if his bladder's full, right? We use our frontal lobe when we have to go and we're sitting in a meeting. I suppress that, right? I can hold it for hours. I can, to my own detriment. I might hold it so long that my bladder hurts, right? But if you have dementia and that part of your brain doesn't work, if you have to go, you got to go. You just go. And that's why people have accidents. You lose track of where you are, what you were doing. So really, really common. But I like to say, think about it has a lot in common with when we're really young. Think about babies and toddlers. As we age, we get better and better at turning on our frontal lobe and suppressing impulses, acting calmer, like controlling urges, right? So dementia is almost bringing us back to the beginning, right? Like babies can't hold their bladder, they just go. and say because they don't have a frontal lobe trained yet either. They have to develop it. Does that make sense? So hopefully that kind of
Yeah. Well,
puts it into.
one of the things, yeah, I didn't, until you're around it, I just thought it was
Right,
all
of
about
course.
memory. I didn't know it had so many behavioral manifestations. But one of the things that was very interesting, I haven't seen him since the last time I saw him was in February. So, and then he has really good days. Like when I haven't seen him for a few months, he'll remember my first and last name, start asking me about the show. Are you still in Los Angeles and a chiropractor?
Right.
And then, yeah, he forgets the short term. But I am curious because he was married a couple times, has five grown kids and grandchildren, but he was a very like sexual person, always had a girlfriend,
Mhm.
always up until maybe 15 years ago. And so when they were talking about putting him in the home, everybody was afraid he still seemed to have that very strong, like maybe I'll meet a
Mhm.
woman. I'd love to be. Is that common too?
Mhm.
Like, and actually it was almost refreshing. Like there's still a part of Bill left, like he
Right.
wanting to meet a woman. Is that something you see a lot with people in?
Absolutely. You will see sort of a little bit what you might find a little unfiltered sexual types of behaviors or flirtatiousness. And again, think of it this way. Sexual, impulse or urge is part of every biological being's nature, right? Because we're here to procreate and, survive, the species to survive. So when you start peeling back those higher human layers of the brain, things
Ah,
like that, those urges are there. And so if they were there earlier in life, I always say the flavor of dementia you're going to have is going to accentuate things that were there a long time ago. So if you have certain strong personality types or areas, those will probably come out more. And so that's a way to anticipate. So you're very observant because if you knew him like that 30 years ago, it's probably going to look, at least for a period until things break down even more, it can be accentuated. That's,
okay.
very
Yeah.
good point.
Well, it's just, what are some of I started following you on LinkedIn and you had these great pages. What are some of the signs that
Mhm.
can alert a loved one? Because I know with him and then another friend of mine, they were both, there were signs and I just dismissed it. Like I had one of my very good friends here in Los Angeles, this was probably 5 or 6 years ago, or maybe four, but he was in town and he called me and said, can I come over and bring a pizza? Let's visit. And I said, I'm in Ventura, which is an hour north. I'm not around, so we'll have to do it another day, maybe tomorrow. And about an hour went by and he called me. I was with my mother and he said, I'm at your house. I got a pizza. And I said, well, I'm not there, and I just kind of chucked it off like that was weird, but it wasn't at all registering to me that he might be having like severe memory. And then about a year ago, when he was in town, he said that they've diagnosed him with some short term. He doesn't like to talk about it, but his there's definitely some memory things. And
Mhm.
now, whenever he visits, I'm noticing, yeah, like the last time he was here, maybe less than a year ago, same type of a thing. We went out for Chinese, and he picked me up. We went out, and then the next morning he showed up, and he was out in front of my place at 10:30 and said, "I'm here to go out to Chinese." And
Mhm.
I don't think he even remembered that we had
Yeah.
gone. I said, "Well, I'm with patients today," but it started a few years ago, and I just didn't recognize it at all. So, how can loved ones? What are some of the things? How do we know when it's just something like, "Oh, well, we all forget things." Like, what do you see?
Right. That's a really good question. And I'll do my best to answer without putting any kind of pressure on loved ones because I don't want to be taken away from this as, oh man, I missed something or I should have done better or anything like that. That's definitely because we can all do that. We can all beat ourselves up. But the fact is, it's really difficult. So to your point, it's super difficult. I mean, you're educated, you're thinking about this stuff all the time. And to be honest, I'm not sure. I might not even notice in one of my loved ones or friends, right? Because just because I might be a certain type of doctor during the day, I take that hat off when I'm with my friends. I don't want to be thinking about that stuff. So with that, caveat, with that disclosure, the things to look for are things that let you know that there's some progressive decline. And so because it can be in many areas, let's say when they're 55, you notice they're having a little trouble remembering names, and yeah, they haven't been sleeping, work stressful, kids are in college, there's a lot of that. We can kind of explain it away. But if you're seeing them at least, let's say every month or every few weeks and over a period of years, it's really over a period of years you'll notice that, oh, it's getting worse and worse. And it's actually you can see it reaching the point that it's going to impair their ability to do their day to day. Like it might get to the point where not just a loved one notices, but maybe a boss at work or a colleague or someone. Like you asked for that document now, like more than seems reasonable, or you're kind of forgetting where things are placed or getting overwhelmed easily. So it can be anything, and think about different domains. So you can think about like home chores type of things. Like, is a person cooking? Are the recipes getting simpler and simpler? Are they cooking more and more bland foods? Are they just not getting the complexities? A lot of times you'll see those people that used to like to cook really and were really good cooks. Now they're eating like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches all the time or
Ah,
something much simpler.
interesting.
Um, Maybe it's a person who, and maybe they're in a relationship, and the person who's always taking care of the finances hands it off, starts kind of either making mistakes and getting caught and handing it off, and you have to ask, like, wait a second, I thought you always liked doing this. Why are you not doing it anymore? So, and then, or getting lost, driving, and like having trouble bumping into things when they're driving, like they're backing out. They're like kind of, you look at the bumper of the car, there's like it's all dinged up and it never used to be.
Oh, interesting.
Um,
Okay.
it's little subtle. It can be so early on. It can be subtle things that like no one would think twice if they were just an outsider looking and they're like, there's a couple scratches. Who cares? So it's got to be in context. You got to know something that this person was really like good or careful about, and they're no longer doing it anymore. Maybe they were an artist and they used to paint every day,
Oh,
and now like that's changed. Something about it. So it's really like you're in the position because you know them to know what to look for. And whatever that is, it's going to kind of like become less organized, less, consistent, and just less complicated, if that makes sense.
okay. Well, in preparing for this interview, I was watching some old 60 Minutes. They've done a few specials on, and it was really where they followed someone, a woman like over 15, 20 years from her initial diagnosis. And it was really hard to watch. I mean, her decline, but the subtleties, okay, little things I wouldn't have even thought of. The cooking one is very interesting. Um, I
Mhm.
definitely want to go into, but there's just so many things. But I did see a group in Colombia that has a super high percentage of early onset dementia who get it in their 40s and then they die within 10 years. There's
Mhm.
something about a gene on a chromosome 14. It's I guess, a really rare genetic. Have you heard about this group at all? Or
Chromosome 14. This is in Colombia, the country.
yes, I just learned of it when I was preparing for this interview, but it was just fascinating
Oh,
because
yes, yes.
yeah, I just
It's,
had
yeah.
have you seen this before?
Yes, yeah, it's referring to the presenilin one gene. Yep. So there's more than a handful, but there's a several, not an enormous number, but there's more than a handful of genes that are directly linked to early onset dementia, meaning it's genetic, it's usually autosomal dominant. What that means is when you look at your family tree, about half of people have it. So like you have a 50% chance of getting it or not, the way the genes come down from your parents. And that's what this one falls into. And so if you have that, again, you don't have a 100% chance, but if you do start having dementia, it's most likely going to be in this early, more severe pattern. Just to be clear, this is extremely, extremely rare.
Yeah.
At University of Washington, where I trained, we had a couple families. The earliest I've ever diagnosed Alzheimer's, specifically Alzheimer's, is in the early 30s. But that is because that person had a Scandinavian gene. Again, one of those families. There's some clusters in Sweden and Scandinavia, here in Colombia. So there's a few of these, but it's those specific genes. But again, because you tend to get it early because of lots of reasons. It's very, very rare. But very, yeah, good point. Those are reasons that to study because a lot of the drugs and way we learn about the disease is by studying these families. So it's been extremely,
It- yeah,
valuable.
it sounded like so I definitely want to talk about like the treatments and things like that. But before that, there's one more question. Like, what are some other things that can be mistaken for dementia, like mental illness or hearing loss, sleep apnea, like those things that hadn't even crossed my
Oh,
mind.
absolutely.
Have you seen people misdiagnosed
Uh,
before?
oh, absolutely. On a few occasions, I would say it's not common, but a few occasions I actually will take someone, will come to me with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or some type of dementia, another type, and I will actually tell them they don't have dementia. That's not common because by the time they're seeing me, there's usually enough history to show that it's been, progressive. But there are what we call reversible or modifiable forms of memory loss or cognitive decline. So if you're, any age really, but if you're getting older and you have untreated sleep apnea, you're going to look like you have dementia. I mean, I mean, if you can't sleep at night, hopefully we all know, and I know you know, Janice, sleep is just critical for your brain's healing for all kinds of reasons. Whole another podcast on the episode on that,
Mhm.
but that will cause it. And so I've seen people, I'll do cognitive testing, and let's say they get a score of 80 out of 100. We'll get them on CPAP, see them back in a few weeks, and they'll easily get a normal score. It'll jump right back up. So that's a big one. Things like B12, vitamin B12 deficiency, not common, but does happen. That can mimic dementia. That will make you feel like you have dementia, but is fixable if you take it. So lots of things like that. So that some of it's nutritional, some of it's lifestyle. But even things like basic things like hearing loss. If you just refuse to wear your hearing aids, some of that's reversible. People might think you have memory loss, but the reality is
Right.
it is bad for your brain, but also you're not, able to hear the information and actually store it. So there are kind of a list of things we go down. When you come into the doctor's office, your primary care, they're going to be like, wait a second, is this a thyroid issue? Is it B12? Is it sleep? Is it depression? Is it anxiety? As we get older, all of those things can mimic dementia and need to be kind of ruled out. They need to be treated first.
Okay. Let's talk about the drugs that have been used the last 25 years that have
Sure.
targeted these amyloid plaques. And just from what I read, it doesn't look like they've been real successful out of all the money that's been put into
Of course.
Alzheimer's
Yeah.
research. It looks like the stat was only 1% of the drugs have been helpful. So what's currently being used and what are the pros and cons and what are your thoughts on research and what's happened here?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say as a member of the public who's worried for myself, even when I get older, I mean, it's been a huge disappointment for decades now. I mean, we have spent many, many billions of dollars as a society just in the US alone. And we don't have a lot to show for it. Do we have a lot of better understanding and research? Absolutely. But as a patient who, is suffering or a loved one is suffering, yeah, not a lot we can do about it still. There's no cure. There are some promising now signs of new modifying drugs coming out, and you kind of referring to that. So just in the last few years, I think about 4 years ago now, might have been that first FDA approval. All of these most recent ones are targeting amyloid, which is that protein I mentioned earlier that's driving Alzheimer's. So we're getting a lot of this amyloid in our brain. It's sticking and breaking down our brain cells. And so for decades now, for well over 30 years, companies have been trying to develop drugs that will go in and somehow get that amyloid out some way, like get it away from your brain. And so the challenge is, although we've learned a lot, that doesn't seem to be in and of itself sufficient. Like it's not enough to just do that. And it turns out things like as you're getting older, a lot of normal cognitive people, a lot of normal memory people have amyloid. And so it's hard to explain, but like if you grab a 95-year-old and that has Alzheimer's and one that doesn't, their brain in terms of amyloid might actually look the same. So it's not a one-to-one. Now, there's other proteins, other targets that are very promising, but that's been a big source of frustration and a big source of controversy is the amount of time and money being been spent on this one hypothesis that is very clearly now not in and of itself the right path. Certainly not the whole picture, and it certainly can't fix things on its own. There's now 3 or 4 drugs in that category that are out. And prior to that, really, I think what you were referring to, it's really just been they call them acetylcholinesterase inhibitors like donepezil and rivastigmine and galantamine. And then memantine is the other one, which is in a different class. And those have been out for well over 20 years. So it hasn't been a lot. And those have mild effects. And across the board, all of these drugs are best when you do it earlier. But the problem is we don't have a system that identifies dementia early. So it's this kind of catch 22, like okay, if we can catch it early and treat it early, we will add years of quality of life to you. But we don't know how to catch it early, or at least we're not doing it widely. So part of the problem is, yeah, drugs hasn't had a lot of great success yet, but also part of it is we're not great at diagnosing and catching it early. It's
So,
okay.
well, people always ask, what can I do? What's the best thing I do? There's a
Sure.
million supplements out there, like do crossword puzzles every day, learn, keep your brain busy. But I know the two people that I'm close to, Bill, he's a retired Navy physicist, and he had a lot of patents, very active, all constantly, probably
Mhm.
than most people I know as far as keeping, and it didn't seem to like really prevent what happened. And then my friend Mel, he's been a very busy film director and executive producer for the last 40 years, and it's still somebody who does crossword puzzles. So I don't know if I'm big on exercise. I tell all my patients
Yeah.
until the end, as much as you can exercise, walking, it doesn't happen. But what are your thoughts on all of these like ideas as far as warding it off?
Absolutely. So exercise by far and away the number one preventer. If you're doing moderate, cardiovascular exercise, at least, we say about 150 minutes a week. You usually spread it out a little bit, of course. You don't want to probably do, 2.5 hours all at once. But if you're doing, and that means your heart rate is elevated, you feel a little bit out of breath. Maybe it's hard to speak when you're doing what you're doing. Like it's kind of like, hey, how's it going? That kind of exercise. So walking is great, but when we talk about exercise for dementia prevention, we mean just one step above like that moderate exercise. That prevents, I mean, a significant percentage of dementias and actually modifies it, makes it a lot, slower, take longer to start. So by far and away, that's definitely the best thing to do. It's just very anti-inflammatory for your brain. Exercise is that level. A lot of hormones and chemicals being released that are really good for you. So that's great advice. And then the other things that sort of add up to what we call this 40% of dementias that could be either reversed or modified or prevented in some ways are some of the things we've talked about, but also we mentioned correcting hearing loss, smoking, so weight loss or correcting obesity. If again obesity over a certain amount, and that's different than exercise, right? They can help each other, but that's different. Having a lot of like visceral, like fat that's deposited inside around your organs, that's really high risk for vascular disease. Um, Diet comes into play. Absolutely. You want, relative, like what we kind of refer to as anti-inflammatory diet. So things that don't cause big spikes in your blood sugar. So, you don't want to necessarily eat a big plate of processed, flour type of things like rices and pastas and, potatoes, just a huge amount of, carbs. We want generally just roughly lower carb. It's different for everybody. So I say that with a huge, little caveat. You have to know what works for you, but on average, most people could do with higher healthy fats, higher good proteins and lower carbs. And just carbs are easy to come by, right? So we're surrounded by like we're eating chips all the time, sodas. It's what's in our face. Every vending machine, every store, it's on the front shelf. Generally just avoid that stuff. If it's easiest to grab in the aisle, then just don't do it. That's usually there's a reason there's not apples, at the checkout line, right? Unfortunately. So think about the things that are probably like tucked away. And those are all things that can help really slow down dementia, reduce your risk. One thing I will say as a big reassurance to anyone listening that has family members, because I hear this very commonly, oh, my aunt or uncle or mother or father, grandfather, etc., had dementia, so it's a given. I'm going to have it. There's no point. And I will tell you, those things we just talked about, those add up to a lot more risk reduction, meaning those all will add up to reducing your risk of dementia much, much more than even if both of your parents had Alzheimer's disease and died of that. So even if both parents had it, that's still actually only just a few percentage points. It's only like a 6, 7, 8%. It's not even as much as you having hearing loss in middle age and not correcting it for many years. So not wearing your hearing aids is more likely to cause dementia than both of your parents having it. So
Mm.
just put that in perspective. It's scary, right? If both your parents had something, you're logically going to think, oh boy, I'm definitely going to get this thing. But one piece of reassurance I like to give folks is that's not the case. And so, yeah, I don't want you to be paralyzed and say, and give up. There's lots of reason to do these healthy habits that you talk about, Janice.
Well, it looks like from what saw that you have done a lot of research, and there's with the sound and
Digital biomarkers, yeah,
yeah, I'd love for people to
absolutely.
learn about that and how you can, and then I think you even mentioned, was it Ronald Reagan in one of your
Yes,
discussions, how years before he was diagnosed, you could go back and hear it in his voice. Now, I had never seen any research like this, but let's hear about your research with the voice.
absolutely. And yeah, and this is, that was a figure we used not for any other reason than they had a lot of publicly available data, right? There's interviews with him since he was a kid. So easy to get. That's all that was about. We've actually looked at the same thing with Muhammad Ali, similar thing. There's lots of transcripts, and video and audio recordings going back. So one of the things that drives me is how do we detect things early in a way that people can act on, do something about, and in a way that's affordable, it's accessible, it's easy. Great that we have these new drugs, but the vast majority of people can't even afford them, even if they were to be more helpful. Same thing with testing. I don't want to have to order a multi-thousand-dollar brain scan and have you have to drive or fly somewhere to get it, right? And so I'm very interested in how do we use technology to help diagnose and catch things in the comfort of your home with data that's already there. You don't have to go way out of your way and spend a lot of money and that kind of thing. So that's where we ended up. For years, we studied voice because we thought to ourselves, some of it just initially logical, like with Parkinson's, we knew, well, people know with Parkinson's, you often see tremor, some shaking. We all know, those of us that have been around Parkinson's, people's voices tend to get softer. They can get a little bit raspy. They can get shaky. And I thought, wait a second, well, if that's happening, can't we detect that automatically? And so we went ahead and studied several different populations and we published papers, things from schizophrenia to depression to Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, really trying to see, can you detect anything? And it turned out you absolutely can. And it's actually quite accurate, meaning in Alzheimer's, very common things. One example is you use a lot more pronouns than nouns. So instead of saying, oh, Janice went to the store, I will say, oh, she went to the store. It's tricks that our brain, people are smart. So if they're starting to lose their memory, they don't want socially for people to notice. So what are they going to do? Automatically, without thinking, they're going to keep talking in a way that is acceptable. So instead of saying the names, I'm just going to use pronouns. I'm going to say, no, she, her, whatever. And that way people don't notice. People aren't like, oh, what's going on? You don't remember? You're just using another word. So that ratio really starts to shift, and we saw that. There's things in your voice too, just even like the shakiness and the tone, those also changed. We looked at actually hundreds of features. A lot of these features are not even really that perceptible to the human ear, and that's why I get excited about technology, right? Because it can measure things that I can't even hear. We were looking at hundreds. The same thing with, for example, schizophrenia, even so something different than dementia. You can really start to pick up people's different types of language, paranoid thoughts or anxiety or concerns, right? So I think voice, there's several companies now still working in the space. It's very promising. I think it's going to be, it's already being used in various areas. And I think it's going to become more and more commonplace to, be patients to be able to say, oh, you know what, I'm going to take a voice sample instead of, an expensive test.
Well, I haven't seen anything with voice yet, but I have seen AI being applied. I mean,
Yeah.
with the breast cancer, they because of the data, they can look at MRIs and detect it like 5 years
Yes.
early. So maybe if it's finesse, maybe AI with research like yours will, if they're intertwined. But since you mentioned you're really interested in the technology, it wasn't on the list of questions, but what are your thoughts on all these like Neuralink and brain computer interfaces? Because I know,
Yes.
like, what from what I can see, they're marvelous, and the I know many. many people will be like, I would never put anything in my brain. This is crazy. The government's just trying to track you. That's what this is. But I look at it like when I see someone like Michael J. Fox who can't really almost, he can barely walk or speak, and
Mhm.
he's talked about it, like he'll fall. He's broken almost every bone in his face because he face plants and falls all the time. Like if I
Right.
were in that situation, I'd be like, you couldn't get me one of those brain chips fast enough. Let me try anything to
Right.
help this. So what are your thoughts on these brain computer interfaces?
Great question. I think they have a ton of promise. To be honest, it's moving faster than I was anticipating. I mean, some of these recent, kind of demos or testing that I've been seeing just in the public, like everyone else, pretty impressive. So that's exciting. Definitely for people that have like the obvious applications or things like, oh, I don't have use of my arms, so I can, use my brain to control something. So that's um, extremely exciting. I think it's going to help that kind of thing too will actually help people with dementia because I'll give you an example that's not quite, brain interface, but when I've had some patients who have, have the means and so they have a car with full self-driving, capability. I will let them drive longer than if they didn't because the car is able to keep you a lot safer than if you don't have all those, gadgets and gizmos in there. So same thing with the brain computer interface. If as it gets more mature and it's kind of getting smarter, well, if I have dementia and I'm supposed to be going to the store, and picking up a few things from the grocery list, that might actually help maybe be able to help nudge people or just kind of keep them on track a little bit. So lots of possibilities. It's really fascinating. Certainly, it's still early, but in terms of some of the results we're seeing, it's quite impressive. I mean, it's clearly showing that there's a path forward that this can happen.
Well, what are the projects that you're working on as a neuropsychiatrist? And then are you still doing the let's see, what did I say, MedFlow and frontier psychology?
Yeah.
What's your current area of research and what are you doing?
Absolutely. My research right now, the few projects I'm working on that we're working on where it'll be paper and papers that will publish and, data that we'll share with the public are all around things like getting what we know works into the hands of patients and often in terms of rural areas. So a lot of my focus the last several years has been states like serving patients in states like Montana, Idaho, Alaska, Wyoming, and really rural parts of any state, because all 50 states have rural areas, believe it or not. Right, there's healthcare deserts everywhere, so lack of resources. So a lot of my research is about can I bring the best possible care available anywhere, period, in person or virtual, anywhere, to anyone in those areas. And that's using often technology or automating workflows, making sure we don't miss anything. So if you're a certain age and you're supposed to get tested or screened for something like breast cancer, like colon cancer, how do we make sure that people get those tests and then we act on them quickly? So a lot of my research tends to be these days like quality and process related, because if we actually did everything we knew in medicine today, our healthcare outcomes would be a lot better. But as those of us know, any one of us that's interacted with the healthcare system knows right off the bat, it's pretty broken. It just doesn't work well. And there's obviously lots of episodes we could talk about that. So I'm most attracted to that. Like, oh, I know how to fix this now. Why can't we fix this right now? Like, I don't need this new fancy drug. Yes, I want those too, but there's so much I can do right now with tools we have.
Let's talk about caregiving because that can
Yeah,
be, you've mentioned that in some of the clips I've seen. And then I just wish I could remember the name of it years ago. I think there's somewhere like in Switzerland, they've created
yeah,
like a village for people,
yeah.
and it takes them back in time instead of like living in a traditional home, that they're more into, there's medical personnel everywhere, of course.
Right.
But the seniors, I don't know if you're familiar with what I'm talking about, but
Yes.
I would personally like love to see more of this kind of thing here implemented in the United States. But let's talk about that,
Yes.
and then because and one of the other things I've seen is it can be really overwhelming for family members. And well, it's very expensive to hire caregivers, so family members try
Yes.
to do it all themselves. But then even, and you can tell your friends, hey, you need a break. But I don't know if it's guilt or or sometimes the person, I have heard this from several friends, like, well, I'll say you need to take a break. You can't do this 24/7. You'll collapse. And if something happens to you, who's going to take care of your mom or dad? But they'll say, well, my mom doesn't want anyone in the house besides me. And I think, well, at
Right.
some point you have to. Can you talk about the nuances of
Yes. Yes.
caregiving?
Really big topic, and it's great you're bringing this up because I think obviously it's at the end of the day, it's what's affecting me today, right now, with my loved one. It's caregiver burnout, caregiver stress. That is among the most common things we're treating. And so I always say when a patient comes to me and the question is about their memory, I'm never just treating the patient. I'm treating whoever is around them. And pretty quickly, that will become the most important thing because as you can imagine, like the friend you mentioned at the beginning of our chat here, if they don't have anyone, they're going to end up having to go someplace else, and that's not always smooth, right? And that might be further from some of the people they know. And so you want to try to keep people as much as possible in their communities. I think some of the communities you're referring to, I know of villages that are really good at taking care of various things like dementia. Some of those are in the Netherlands, where they're just much. It's ingrained in the society that they take care of their elders as they get older. They keep them as independent as possible, as local as possible, and it's just built in. We just don't, there's lots of reasons it can work there. I don't want to, I'm not the type of person who says like, oh, the grass is greener on the other side, everything's always better somewhere else. The fact is, in the US, we're a much larger country. We have a lot of empty space between us. We have a huge, dearth or just lack of resources in comparison. So there's lots of reasons. So without getting into that, the things that those places are doing well is rallying community resources around a patient, which means that when that patient's getting older, they're not just relying on, like, let's say one person or one thing, where that one person then is going to get burned out, right? So if I'm getting older and I have dementia and I'm relying fully on my daughter who's raising kids, and has a full-time job, that's not going to go so well. So I will say, Janice, when I'm talking with families, one of the biggest things I do is help shift them to accepting that outside help is going to be okay. Sometimes that's getting the patient to accept because plenty of patients say, "Oh, I don't want anyone in my house. I can do this
Exactly.
myself." Or a husband or a wife who's like, "Nope, it's my duty. I'm going to take care of them." Or the lack of education. There's lots of angles that you have to come at this with, but the bottom line is, I will be pretty forceful about saying we need to get in-home caregiver support much earlier than you think, because by the time you think you need it, it's definitely too late, right? And then not to mention you're going to be waiting months, right? Because it takes time to find someone and test it out and all that. The other benefit to early diagnosis is by diagnosing a formal dementia earlier, you mobilize resources. There's really not much downside. In fact, I don't think there's really any downside to early diagnosis. But if insurance gets a claim and says, "Oh, you want caregiver support," but it just says in your chart, you have some mild depression, you have some arthritis, and you have some high blood pressure, we don't pay for those things. But if they get in their chart, "Oh, you have Alzheimer's disease," oh, we do pay for caregiver support for that. So Medicare and other insurances, Medicaid, the VA, we take care of a lot of veterans across the board, they will pay for someone to come in your house and do all kinds of things. It could be helping you go grocery shopping. It could be housekeeping chores. It could be, as dementia progresses, helping you get dressed. It's any number of things, but insurance will pay for that with the right diagnosis. So that's a big reason to get diagnosed early. And then I'm pretty pushy with people to say, we're diagnosing, insurance will pay for it. I just want you to get started. Let's just start with 1 or 2 hours a week. Just test it out. You're not stuck with it. You change your mind. And I'll tell you, to date, have people had to switch or find, better fit or, that kind of thing? Absolutely. But I've never had anyone after all these years come to me and say, I regret getting an in-home caregiver. I wish I didn't do that. It's never happened. And you can imagine, I've had certain patients that have tremendously strong opinions against it at first. And I kind of have to do, and you got to do it on their own time, to meet with them a few times, warm them up. It's like motivational interviewing, right? But It's a huge thing. So, anyways, that's my biggest message is if you think you don't need the help or you're on the fence or anything, I definitely encourage people to just accept the help. It can come in the form of volunteers first. It can come in the form of insurance if you have a doctor that can help you make the diagnosis. But it's you got to get help, and that's what those villages in the Netherlands do well for lots of reasons. But what we struggle with here is, a lot of people feel isolated. They just don't know where to look. I will mention, you've probably mentioned this before, but Alzheimer's Association is really good at finding resources. If you have no other connection, you haven't even seen your doctor yet. What's cool is Alzheimer's information number. They answer it pretty well during business hours. It's usually staffed by like a master's level type of like social worker or clinical worker. Super helpful, very educated, and they're really good at finding local resources. So I'm a big fan of the Alzheimer's Association. They're pretty good about knowing, oh, we have a chapter nearby, and here's the, in-home caregiver support resources near you. So, really big topic.
Well, I've experienced it closely, and yeah, and the I mean, if you don't have family, one thing I did want to mention, because I don't think a lot of people, this a friend of mine, another woman I lived with in college, she ended up having dementia at the end, and if it once I don't know about the East Coast, but out here on the West Coast, like once it's in your medical chart that there's like cognitive impairment, they
Mhm.
don't really let you change any kind of legal documents. So it's really important for people
Mhm, mhm.
to plan. Like for years, I mean, for 20 years, and most people don't, no matter how much I encourage everyone to have something called like a advanced healthcare directive
Yes,
and there's a power of attorney, a general power of attorney, a healthcare power of attorney, and people don't even think about it. But by the time you need one, often it's like too late and you can't
yes,
make changes, and the importance of having them like saved into the cloud in case your house. I saw something the other day about somebody was traveling, and then their mom ended up in a home, had an emergency situation, but this person was traveling and they didn't have access to their power of attorney with them. But it made me think like I don't have all that in the cloud either, saved on it. But to have these discussions and have a plan, and again, you can't make any changes once that's in your medical record. So it's important to really think about it before something happens, to have
right.
a plan, this advanced healthcare directive. Is there anything, well, one thing I forgot to ask you about, is going back to like the impulse control. One thing that a lot of people don't realize that can happen. I mean, they can have these like hypersexual impulses, but the violent and aggressive behavior. And I just learned I haven't experienced that, but I've read and seen that it can be a real problem. So to prepare people for that, can you explain a little bit about what's going on, like with the hitting or maybe the kicking and biting that can happen as
Right.
start losing their minds?
Absolutely. As dementia advances, again, it's not common, but it can happen. So it's not the majority of people, it's in a minority of people. But when it does happen, it can be really hard. And I always have to remind people, uh, it's different for everybody, but you have to find a way to not take it personally, meaning that behavior, that lashing out, that aggression is not a targeted thing. Almost always, advanced dementias, they're not out to get you, or they're not like they might say things or do things that make you feel like, wow, that's pretty personal. But that unfortunately, as again, those smarter human parts of our brain start breaking down, that animal brain starts to come out. And for a lot of people, fight or flight, a lot of people it's fight, right? It's not running, it's facing and fighting. And a lot of it, really the majority of the time, and this is probably why these rates are lower in villages like the ones in the Netherlands, if you take the time, if you step back just like you do with your toddler, or with a child, if you think about how to approach someone differently, it usually will solve it. Not always. Sometimes medication, is helpful, but I would say the majority of the time when it does happen, it can be treated behaviorally, meaning, let's give an example. You have someone who's maybe in a home, they just moved, so transitions are really hard and they've been agitated. And so, the caregiver totally trying their best, really wanting to help, well-intentioned is like, oh, we slept in a little bit. It's almost time for breakfast. And if we don't get to the cafeteria by 8, we're going to not get breakfast. It's going to be a whole thing. And, I know you're hungry. And here's a person with dementia. They don't know. They don't know what time it is. They just know that they're hungry and they're angry. And they're saying, "Oh, I gotta change you. I gotta get you ready to go to the cafeteria." So they come up to you and they start, taking your pants off and doing all that. I just, if again, this isn't, it's hard to do this. I know sometimes we're rushing or we don't have time, but just thinking about if someone came up to you and started pulling your pants off, you're going to probably punch them. Like most people would be like, what the hell are you doing? And if you think about it, if someone has advanced dementia, they have no idea who you are or what the heck you're doing. So if you're going up to them and you're pulling their pants down, I think a normal reaction is actually punching someone. So a lot of times when you ask yourself it that way, you realize, oh, it's not even what I call it aggression or non-compliance or combativeness. Not really. Oh, get in the shower, pull down your, pull off your clothes. So there's a way to do it again, but in the world we live in, sometimes we just don't have the time or we feel time pressure. But what that person really needs is a little just more gentle touch, more a slower approach. Hey, I'm going to help you now get on their level. It's taking the time that often we just don't give ourselves or we don't have. And some of this is outside of caregiver control. So I don't want to blame caregivers or staff. Sometimes they're in a facility and they have to take care of 20 patients and they've got 20 minutes.
Oh,
So
God.
none of this is to say it's a pointing a finger at any individual, but that agitation or that aggression, almost always I've been able to treat. And I've taken care of patients in every type of facility imaginable in these states and many states. So, but again, it's a matter of staff time, your time, and just patience. And when it's a loved one, remember, it's a lot harder to just step back and not take it personally. And that's where the in-home caregiver can actually help more because they're less likely to take it personally, right? If I don't know you, but I'm helping you, and you tell me, I hate you, go away. I'm gonna be, oh, you have dementia, and I think I know how to handle this. But if you say that to your son or daughter, it's hard for them not to be upset, right? And so it's really hard to make that transition. So you have to grow some thick skin and change the dynamic. And it's not about correcting and being right and taking it personally. So they're saying it's Tuesday, it's Tuesday. Don't tell them it's Wednesday, right?
Yeah, the correct.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of those types of things. But if we slow down, almost always you can address that agitation.
Is there anything, I know we just kind of scratched on the surface of dementia,
Yeah.
Alzheimer's, we could talk for hours, but is there anything really important that I might not have asked that you would like the public to know? I'm definitely
I
going
would just say that the overarching message is yes, we are at a turning point in terms of diagnostics and treatment. So we're getting better and better quickly at diagnosing early. We have blood tests coming out. We have skin biopsies coming out, all things that are faster and easier. We're getting better at treatment. There's a number of many drugs in the pipeline, so that's all promising. But my biggest point to patients and to families today is there's a lot you can do right now. So we don't have to wait, but go down the list of things we talked about earlier. Do one thing at a time, one habit at a time. Don't overwhelm. Just pick one thing. Like we're going to introduce a few more minutes of moderate exercise in today and make that a habit. Then move on from there. But go down the checklist one thing at a time. And you will have, regardless of where you or your loved one is on the dementia journey, it will have a significant impact that you will notice. You will add a year, 2 years more of the quality of life for this person, and you'll have more time with that person. So I just wanted to leave with that message of hope. It's not false hope. It's true. It's not always fun, right? It's hard work and it's the things that we always talk about, but they really do make a difference.
All right. Well, thank you. Maybe we'll speak again in the future, but
Yes,
I sure appreciate your time today. And it was very
happy to.
informative and educational. And I'll keep following you. I'll see you on LinkedIn. All right.
Yes, please. Yeah, anyone else, yeah, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. I will, and feel free to send me anything you think I should write about. I'm happy to comment. And yeah, thank you for having me, Janice.
Okay. Enjoy. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings, where we talk about the brain and all things mental health. Hope to see you next week, and please share with your friends.